The island nation of Singapore has always been one of the best places to be born in, live in, and work in. This happened because the country was so successful in implementing the right economic models. Models that they have implemented for decades upon decades, since the time of Lee Kuan Yew. These economic models, however, have one unique attribute: duplication, or rather the world copy. Much of what Singapore is today is actually copied elsewhere. An article published by the HuffPost and written by Kishore Mahbubani highlighted this through what former Deputy Minister of Singapore Goh Keng Swee said when he was talking to Kishore. No matter what problem Singapore encounters, somebody somewhere has solved it. Let us copy the solution and adapt it to Singapore. Although a few remarks made by a former Deputy Prime Minister and once chaired the Monetary Authority of Singapore may not stand as the entire story of Singapore's economic success. A grander view will land us in a country known as Japan, a not-so-far destination from Singapore, and a country that shares a deep history. You see, Japan, even before Asia was ever counted as a rising superpower, one that saw its economy surpass any other continent, was already a powerhouse. They were the first, at least in modern history, as the reigning supreme and the leader of Asia, a truly exceptional country, which back then and even until today. Singapore, however, through its aggressive leaders, saw Japan as its model to follow. Who would, after all, be a model to follow if it was not for Japan? Hence, Singapore, especially Lee Kuan Yew, wanted to copy the country's productivity levels and manufacturing capabilities, and as believed by these leaders, would help Singapore become a high-tech advanced society. Decades later, since Lee Kuan Yew's vision, Singapore had indeed emerged to become a global phenomenon. Where the country had initially sought to copy others is now itself being copied upon. The question is, to what extent did Singapore really copy Japan? Was it really just a connection between the establishment of similar economic models, or is there more to it? After all, throughout the economic growth of Singapore, not only were they copying the strategies implemented by Japan, but Japan was also itself being an active country in Singapore. They were investing, sending many executives down the island nation, and have been amongst the initiators of many foreign investments. Well, to understand these further, let us divide these into two factors in more detail: how Singapore emulated Japan, and how Japan paved the way for many investments in Singapore. Let us dive into the first, which is Japan's stance in Singapore. It's pretty well known that Singapore has been quote-unquote the world's hub. It is a hub for everything, whether it be for financial institutions, maritime trade, overseas headquarters, and so on. Like Singapore's stance, Japan has also been fairly interested in the island nation. In fact, since the 1960s, when Singapore started its industrialization, Japan was always one of the top 3 investors in the island nation. Their sentiment for investing in Singapore is divided into two factors. The first is because Japanese-based companies were trying to offshore some of their work to cut down costs. The second of which was due to Singapore's manufacturing availability. They were the first country in Southeast Asia to present an offshore manufacturing opportunity to other countries. It's quite an outstanding feat because the region was embattled by both political instability and consistent border-to-border issues. Singapore's standing up with its own manufacturing capabilities in the midst of neighboring challenges was a unique feat. This has then eventually helped build a relationship between the two. The most significant initial investment made was during the introduction of Singapore's Jurong industrial town. It was spearheaded to encapsulate factories. This led to big waves of Japanese companies opening in Singapore. From the 1970s to 1980s, Singapore saw companies like Walbro Singapore Limited, which was a subsidiary of a company from Japan that was a manufacturer of carburetors. They had a registered capital of about $2 million. Soon after, they received another Japanese production company by the name of Nachi Fujikoshi Corporation, which had a capital of $6 million and a fixed investment of $16 million. Their plant in Jurong initially employed 270 people in a 20,000-hectare factory. Amongst the largest, however, during these 2 decades was a company known as Ajinomoto Company, which did not take advantage of Singapore's manufacturing capabilities, but rather due to its financial status. They had set up an investment company with a capital of about $150 million around the mid-1980s. But to begin with, even if we had not taken a look at what kinds of investments done by Japanese companies, it's still very clear how embedded Japan had been in Singapore. We can see this through the infrastructure system of Singapore, where Japan helped to revolutionize the country's rail transportation system. When the mass rapid transit network of Singapore began, they received a lot of help from Japanese construction firms. It is reported in history that 11 out of the 30 civil contracts that were made into the construction of the MRT were awarded by joint ventures of Japanese firms. Even some of the rolling stock that was used in Singapore's MRT operation was supplied by Japanese companies. These were made by companies such as Kawasaki Heavy Industries and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. To quantify all of these today, we can take a look at the latest publicly available data from the Department of Statistics Singapore, which shows that the stock of foreign direct investments in Singapore's manufacturing industry was estimated to be nearly $20 billion. However, since it's the latest data, the amount of investment made into the manufacturing industry is likely to differ from when it was 30 or 40 years ago. Manufacturing was a dominant choice for Japanese firms in Singapore. However, today the largest destination belongs to the country's finance and insurance industry. Japan is estimated to have $45 billion of foreign investments in Singapore's financial industry. And if we sum up every single investment made in every sector, Japan's total investment is a whopping $139 billion of foreign stock investments in Singapore as of 2020, a figure that most people would probably imagine to be figuratively small. But it is a figure that triumphs over mainland China's investments at only $43 billion, as reported by the official database in the Department of Statistics. Further, the historical data provided by the same public database shows that Japan's investment grew from $26 billion in 1998 to where it is today. On the other hand, these are just numbers, and they may not really help us understand just how impactful Japan was in Singapore. What can truly tell us how important Japan has been comes into our second statement from earlier: how Japan became a model for Singapore. To portray the entire story about how Singapore copied Japan, let us go back to Lee Kuan Yew's time. The famous Singaporean leader, who is known to have used his prowess to turn the entire country around, had always appreciated Japan and its culture. The time when Lee Kuan Yew was Singapore's leader was also the time when Japan had exceeded the world in terms of growth, productivity, and success. They were working at a level unseen by much of the developed Western world, and people around the world knew how the quality produced by Japanese goods was. From their automotives to electronics, they were everywhere. Amongst the leading grounds that Lee Kuan Yew wanted to follow was the industrial production of Japan. It had achieved the lowest electricity consumption per unit of production, a feat that happened in the midst of its quality production. Hence, it was also the same feat that Singapore wanted to follow. Singapore's model followed through the establishment of the National Productivity Council, which went on to gather numerous people to learn from Japan. These went on to follow the Japan Productivity Center, led some of the Japanese people to travel to the Southeast Asian nation and help educate its people. Even Lee Kuan Yew himself had been educated in Japanese-style management, which further showcases the importance of Japan. However, despite all of the investments made in time and money, Singapore never really came close to Japan. It was so evident in the investments made by Japanese firms when they were first setting up their offshore business, a clear difference was slated compared to Western countries investing in Singapore. Western nations would open up a factory and employ Singaporean executives, which can suggest that they trust these Singaporeans to operate the factories and facilities. Japanese firms, however, would open up a factory, but send in their own employees to become the executives. It was not only until years and decades of learning and the adoption and iteration that Singapore's productivity model eventually catches up. As noted, they were able to solve this problem by not only emulating how Japan defined productivity, but how Japan viewed education. They saw Japan's view on the importance of math, science, and computers, one that helped Singapore to double its emphasis on it. Furthermore, they had also seen how Japan was always on top of everything. When something new came out, such as new technology, they quickly adapted to them. Therefore, Singapore's stance, especially in the computerization of its government, was adopted the same way as how Japan did it. These were the building years of Singapore. Indeed, these were examples and a very high-level overview of how the two nations interact, starting with Lee Kuan Yew. Today, however, everything is a lot different. Singapore on a per capita basis is way richer than Japan. The GDP per capita of Singapore, according to the IMF, is nearly $80,000, whereas Japan's is only $34,500, a figure that is more than double. Moreover, Singapore, which used to receive investments, is now the one doing a lot of investment overseas. According to the latest publicly available data from SingStat, Singapore's portfolio investments in Japan are estimated to be over $153 billion. This means that Japan is the second largest destination for investments made by Singapore. But anyway, what do you think about the Japan-Singapore relationship? In what ways have you seen the Japanese economic model be adapted not only by Singapore but the rest of the world? Let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.